I'm Cora, I'm 33. And the day they read my grandmother's will, my own cousin looked me in the eye and said I was a thief. The room nodded, every single head. My uncle folded his arms like the verdict was already in. My aunt pressed her lips together and stared straight through me. And I sat there, hands flat on the table, saying nothing, because I had nothing left to say to people who had already decided. But here's what none of them knew. My grandmother had spent the last 4 months of her life quietly building a case. Not in court, not with a lawyer's help, but from a hospital bed with a laptop and a cloud account I'd set up for her myself. What the lawyer pulled out of that sealed envelope made the whole room stop breathing. And I never saw it coming either. Welcome back to calm drama stories, where quiet people finally get heard and the truth shows up right on time. If stories about family, betrayal, and earned justice are your kind of thing, you're in the right place. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from, and be sure to subscribe so the next one finds you. My mother died when I was 12. Ovarian cancer, caught late. My father stuck around for about 6 weeks after the funeral, then drove to a motel in Reno and never came back. I know because he left a note on the counter that said, "I'm sorry, kid," and took the goods suitcase. So Grandma Dorothy took me in. She was 60 years old, lived alone in a 3-bedroom ranch in Hadley, Connecticut, and Shenever once made me feel like a burden. Sundays were ours. She'd start the chicken soup at 7:00 in the morning. Carrots, celery, a bay leaf she'd pull from a jar that had been in the same cabinet since 1987. She'd ladle it into the same blue Tupperware, snap the lid, and hand it to me for the week. "Soup is love you can reheat," she'd say, and she meant it. I put myself through Central Connecticut State on night shifts at a data center, graduated with a degree in information systems, landed a job in cloud infrastructure, and moved 40 minutes away. Close enough to visit, far enough to breathe. I came back every Sunday without fail, drove through snow, through summer construction, through the kind of rain that makes the wipers useless. Because Dorothy Vance was the only person who ever showed up for me without conditions, and I figured the least I could do was show up for her. Everyone in the family loved Grandma's money. I just loved Grandma, and maybe that's why they never understood me, or why they decided I had to be the problem. 14 months before the will reading, Grandma fell. She was reaching for a mixing bowl on the top shelf, the one she used for her cornbread, and her hip gave out on the kitchen tile. I got the call at work, drove 40 minutes in 28, found her sitting on the floor with a dish towel pressed to her elbow, annoyed more than hurt. "I've been falling since before you were born," she told the paramedic. But I saw her face when she tried toss stand. She was scared. After that, I set up a home security system. 2 cameras inside, one at the front door, one covering the living room and kitchen. Nothing fancy. A brand you'd find at any hardware store. I configured the cloud backup myself because that's what I do for a living. Every clip auto-uploaded to encrypted storage on a paid plan I covered myself. Continuous retention, nothing deleted unless you logged in and did it manually. I created the account under her name, her email, her password. Then I removed my own access. She asked me why. I told her it was her home, her privacy. And if she ever needed to show anyone what happened inside those walls, it would be hers to share, not mine. She laughed. Who am I going to show the cat? The little green LED on the living room camera blinked twice when it powered on. Steady rhythm, like a heartbeat. She pointed at it the first week and said, "That little light makes me feel like somebody's watching." I told her that was the whole point. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was that 14 months later, that blinking green light would be the only witness that told the truth when every person in my family chose to lie. Let me tell you about the rest of my family. My Uncle Robert was Grandma's only son. 58 years old, thick hands, a firm handshake, and a leased Cadillac he couldn't afford. He'd been in commercial real estate for 30 years, which sounded impressive until you learned he'd lost money on 4 off-high's last 5 deals. He refinanced his house twice. His wife, my Aunt Sandra, was the kind of woman who posted photos from church every Sunday and somehow made it look like a personal brand. She organized the bake sale, sang in the choir, and kept a mental spreadsheet of who owed her a compliment. Their daughter, my cousin Veronica, was 31 and lived like her life was a highlight reel. Perfect nails, curated posts, blessed in the bio. She worked in pharmaceutical sales and spent like she was in private equity. Veronica and I grew up together, and somewhere around high school, she decided I was competition. Not because I competed, because Grandma kept saying things like, "Cora drove through the snow again last Sunday." That was enough. To them, I was the girl who showed up too much. The one who was always in the kitchen, always fixing something, always there. Robert called me the handyman once at Thanksgiving. Sandra laughed. Veronica didn't even look up from her phone. They never asked about my job. They never asked how I'd paid for school. And they certainly never asked why I came every Sunday. They just assumed I wanted something. The first time I heard Sandra say, "Mom should really think about who's around her so much," I told myself she didn't mean it the way it sounded. She did. 3 things disappeared in the first 2 months. A gold bracelet Grandma wore to my mother's funeral, a pair of garnet earrings she kept in a velvet pouch, and her late husband's wedding band, a plain silver ring she'd stored in the cedar box on her dresser since Grandpa died in 2011. She noticed the ring first, called me on a Tuesday. "Cora, have you seen your grandfather's ring? I could swear I left it in the box." I hadn't. I told her maybe she'd moved it during spring cleaning. She accepted that, but I could hear the doubt in her pause. A week later, Sandra came by for what she called a wellness check. She brought store-bought cookies and a question. "Mom, have you thought about who has keys to the house?" Grandma had 3 sets, one for herself, one for me, one for Robert. Sandra looked at me when she asked, not at Robert, not at anyone else, just me. "It's just something to think about," she added. "You're here so much, Cora. Things get moved around." I didn't take the bait. I washed the dishes, kissed Grandma goodbye, and drove home with my jaw tight and my chest heavy. That night, lying in bed, I thought about what I would have said if I'd been a different person, something sharp, something final. But I'm not built that way. I fix systems. I don't fight people. And I told myself that the truth would surface eventually, because that's what truth does. It doesn't need a megaphone, it just needs time. I was right about that. I was just wrong about how much time and how much it would cost me first. Grandma had a pearl necklace, not costume pearls, real ones with a gold clasp shaped like a seashell. Grandpa gave them to her on their wedding day in 1965, and she wore them exactly 3 times a year. Their anniversary, Christmas Eve, and the day my mother was born. She kept them in the cedar box on her dresser, the same one that once held Grandpa's ring. When I was a girl, she'd let me hold them while she told me the story. "Your grandfather saved for 11 months, she'd say. "He skipped lunch every day and told his boss he was fasting." I clasped them around her neck the day the family came for a group photo. Sandra's idea, something about a church directory. Grandma stood by the window in her navy dress, and the pearls caught the afternoon light. And for a second, she looked 30 years younger. Veronica stared at them the entire shoot. Not at Grandma, at the necklace. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. I saw her fingers twitch once like she was pricing them in her head. After the shoot, while I was helping Grandma change, she put her hand on mine and said, "These are for the one who stays." I told her not to talk like that. She smiled. "I'm 80, sweetheart. I can talk however I want." Everyone in the family knew about the pearls. Robert mentioned their value at least once a year. "Those are worth a good 12,000, you know." Sandra once suggested Grandma put them in a safe deposit box for security. Veronica just watched and waited. Everyone wanted those pearls. Only one person would actually take them. Things kept vanishing. A cameo brooch. A set of gold cufflinks that had belonged to my grandfather's father, a small crystal vase Grandma kept on the mantel. Each time Dorothy would mention it casually, "I must be losing my mind, Cora." And each time Sandra would tighten the noose a little more. "It's concerning." She told Robert on the phone, loud enough for me to overhear at a Sunday lunch. Someone with that much access. She let the sentence trail off. She didn't have to finish it. Then I found out about the group chat. Veronica had created a family text thread months earlier, Vance Family Updates, she called it. Robert, Sandra, Veronica, and Grandma were in it. I wasn't. I discovered this by accident when Grandma showed me a photo Sandra had texted, a picture of her church fundraiser, and I saw the thread name at the top of the screen. 37 messages I'd never seen. Was I in this chat? I asked Grandma. She squinted at the phone. I thought so, sweetheart. Maybe it's a glitch. It wasn't a glitch. I checked my own phone, no thread, no invitation, no record I'd ever been included. I told myself it was an oversight. Maybe Veronica just forgot. Maybe there were 2 threads. But that night I sat in my apartment with the overhead light off and my phone in my hand, scrolling through my messages, looking for a conversation that didn't exist. And I realized something that should have been obvious months ago. They weren't just suspicious of me. They were building something. Being left out of a group chat sounds small. It wasn't. Grandma's heart started TOEFL in October. Congestive, the cardiologist said, fluid buildup. She'd be out of breath after walking to the mailbox. She stopped baking. She stopped going to church. The world got smaller one room at a time until most of her days were spent in the recliner by the living room window wrapped in a blue Afghan I'd bought her 4 Christmases ago. I came every Sunday. I still came every Sunday. But now I also came on Wednesdays and sometimes Fridays, and I brought the soup to her instead of the other way around. The last time she ate a full bowl was in November. I sat across from her at the kitchen table watching her hands shake around the spoon, and I wanted to say something large and meaningful, but all I managed was more crackers. She shook her head. Then she looked past me toward the living room doorway where the little green light on the camera blinked its steady rhythm. She watched it for a long moment, longer than made sense. "Don't worry about me, sweetheart," she said quietly. "See more than they think." I almost asked her what she meant. Almost. But her eyes were tired and the soup was getting cold, and I told myself she was just being Grandma. Cryptic and stubborn and always 3 steps ahead of everyone in the room. I kissed her forehead and cleared the dishes and drove home in the dark. That was our last Sunday soup. 6 weeks later she was gone and I still didn't know what she meant. But Dorothy Vance had always kept her promises. Every single one. She just made this one from the other side. Dorothy Vance died on a Tuesday in December. Heart failure. The hospice nurse called me at 6:14 in the morning and I drove to the house in sweatpants and a coat I didn't zip. She was still in the recliner. The Afghan was pulled up to her chin and her reading glasses sat on the armrest like she'd just set them down to rest her eyes. I held her hand for a long time. It was cold, but I held it anyway. Robert arrived an hour later. Sandra came with him, already dressed for company. Lipstick, earrings, a black cardigan she must have picked in advance. Veronica showed up around noon with a latte and a face full of fresh makeup. I handled the logistics, called the funeral home, pulled the insurance folder from the filing cabinet, started a list of people to notify. While I was in the bedroom getting Grandma's address book, I opened the cedar box on the dresser. It was empty. The pearls were gone. Grandpa's ring already missing. The cameo gone months ago, but the pearls had been there 2 weeks earlier. I'd seen them. I'd straightened the box when I changed her sheets. I stood in the bedroom doorway holding the empty cedar box, and I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Not grief. I already had that. This was something else. The slow recognition that someone in my family had come into this house while my grandmother was dying and taken the only thing she'd ever said was mine. I closed the box. I put it back on the dresser, and I didn't say a word to anyone because I didn't yet know who to accuse, and I wasn't the kind of person who accused without proof. The funeral was on Friday. White lilies, polished pews, a program Sandra had designed herself with a photo of Grandma from 1998. Younger, sharper, not the woman any of us had seen in the last year. Robert gave the eulogy. He talked about sacrifice. He talked about family values. He used the phrase unconditional love 3 times and made eye contact with the pastor when he said it. Sandra stood beside the casket and greeted every guest by name like she was hosting a dinner party. She shook hands. She accepted condolences. She said, "She's at peace now." So many times it started to sound rehearsed. Veronica posted a tribute reel before the service ended. 15 seconds of old photos set to piano music, captioned, "Rest easy, Grandma," with a white heart emoji. It got 200 likes before the reception started. I carried the folding chairs. I drove the leftover flower arrangements to the church basement. I signed the paperwork at the funeral home because no one else offered, and I wrote the check for the balance because no one else volunteered. No one filmed that. No one posted it. After the service, while the family picked at cold cuts in the church hall, I overheard Robert corner Gerald Aldridge, Grandma's estate attorney, by the coffee station. "When can we schedule the reading?" Robert asked. Not, "How are the arrangements?" Not, "Is everything in order?" When Aldridge stirred his coffee and said, "I'll be in touch." Robert nodded like he'd just closed a deal. I watched him walk back to Sandra, lean down and whisper something. She smiled. At a funeral. That smile told me everything I needed to know about what was coming. It started small. A comment at the reception. Sandra standing near the dessert table, speaking to 2 women from her Bible study group. "We've been noticing things going missing from Mom's house," she said, just loud enough. "Jewelry, mostly. It's heartbreaking." One of the women asked if they'd contacted the police. Sandra tilted her head. "We're trying to handle it within the family. You know how it is. Certain people had more access than others." She didn't say my name. She didn't need to. Everyone in that church hall knew who spent the most time at Dorothy Vance's house. 2 days later, Robert called me. "Cora, I'm not accusing you of anything," he began, which is exactly how people start accusations. "But Sandra and I have been talking, and some items are unaccounted for, and you were there more than anyone." I listened. I let him finish. He talked for 4 minutes without pausing, and then he said, "We just want to clear the air before the will reading." I thanked him for calling. I hung up, and I sat in my car in the parking garage at work for 11 minutes, staring at the concrete wall, feeling something I hadn't felt since the night my father left. The particular sting of being blamed by people who are supposed to protect you. I'm going to pause here, because this is the part I replayed 100 times. If you've ever been the one who showed up and got treated like the suspect, you already know this feeling in your chest. Hit subscribe and stay with me, because what my grandmother had quietly arranged is the part nobody saw coming. A week before the will reading, I went to Grandma's house to pick up the last of the cleaning supplies I'd left under the kitchen sink. Robert's Cadillac was in the driveway. I almost turned around, but I needed the supplies, so I went in through the side door. He was in the dining room, on the phone, packing. I could hear him through the wall. "If I don't cover it by the 15th, we lose the house, Janet. I'm not exaggerating." His voice cracked on house, not angry, afraid. The kind of afraid that doesn't care who hears it. "I've got nothing liquid. The Brookfield deal fell through. Sandra doesn't even know the half of it. I just need 60 days. I stood in the kitchen with a bottle of Windex in my hand and felt something I didn't expect. Pity. For a single moment, Robert wasn't the man who called me the handyman. He was a 58-year-old man watching his life collapse, and he sounded exactly the way I'd sounded at 19, sitting in my dorm room counting coins for ramen. Then he hung up. He walked into the kitchen. He saw me. The fear drained out of his face, and something harder replaced it. "Cora, you're here again." He said it like an accusation, like my presence in my dead grandmother's house was the problem and not the dozens of missing items he'd never once asked about. "Just getting my things," I said. He nodded. Then, without looking at me, he added, "Mom kept a lot of valuables in the bedroom. I hope you've been careful with them." That was the moment the pity died. He wasn't desperate. He was calculating. And desperate people who calculate are the most dangerous kind. That night I thought about the cameras. I'd installed them 14 months ago. Cloud backup, continuous retention, auto-upload. If anyone had gone into Grandma's house and taken anything, the footage would show it, clear as a receipt. I opened my laptop, pulled up the cloud provider's login page, typed in the email address I'd used during setup, Grandma's email, and stopped. I didn't have her password. I'd never saved it. I'd created the account under her credentials, verified it with her phone, and then deliberately removed my own admin access. I did it to respect her privacy. I did it because I'm an infrastructure engineer who believes in access controls and principle of least privilege. And now that principle was locking me out of the only evidence that could clear my name. I tried the recovery option. It sent a code to Grandma's phone, which was sitting in a drawer at her house, locked with a passcode I didn't know. I tried her email directly. Same problem. Two-factor authentication linked to the same dead phone. For about half a second, I wondered whether Dorothy herself had ever actually logged in. I'd walked her through it once, drawn little diagrams on a napkin, but she'd squinted at the screen and said, "Sweetheart, I can barely work the microwave." I'd laughed. She'd laughed. And I'd filed her away as someone who would never touch that account, which meant nobody could. The footage existed. Somewhere on a server in Virginia or Ohio, every clip from the last 14 months was sitting in encrypted storage, time-stamped and untouched, and I couldn't reach any of it. I closed the laptop. I sat in the dark for a while, and I thought about how strange it was that the very thing I'd built to keep my grandmother safe was now the thing I couldn't use to save myself. The system worked exactly as I'd designed it. That was the problem. Aunt Margaret called me on a Thursday afternoon. Margaret was Grandma's younger sister, 76, lived in a retirement community in Glastonbury, wore the same turquoise-reading glasses every day, and had never once in her life raised her voice. She wasn't in the Vance family group chat either. She'd been removed the same week I was. "Cora, I need to show you something," she said. "Can you come over?" I drove to Glastonbury. She was waiting at her kitchen table with a cup of chamomile and her phone face down. She turned it over and slid it toward me, a screenshot. The Vance Family Updates group chat dated 3 weeks before Grandma died. Sandra's message, time-stamped 9:47 p.m. "We need to get ahead of this. Make sure everyone knows Cora is the one who's been alone with Mom's jewelry. If anything comes up at the reading, we need a clear story." Below it, Robert's reply, "Agreed. Keep it simple." She had access. Nobody else did. And Veronica already told 2 people at the reception handled. I read it 3 times. Then I read it a 4th time because I wanted to make sure I wasn't imagining it. I wasn't. They'd planned it. Before Grandma Wasteven cold, they'd built a narrative. Sandra had seeded it. Robert had endorsed it. Veronica had distributed it. And they'd kicked both Margaret and me out of the chat so we'd never see the playbook. Margaret watched me read it. She didn't say, "I'm sorry," or "I knew something was wrong." She just reached across the table and put her hand on mine. "Dorothy would have wanted you to have this," she said. I saved the screenshot to my phone. And for the first time since the funeral, I stopped feeling confused. I wasn't paranoid. I wasn't imagining things. I was being framed. My first instinct was to send that screenshot to everyone, blast it to the family, post it online, forward it to the lawyer. Let the whole world see what Sandra and Robert and Veronica had been doing in the dark. I didn't, not because I was scared, because I know how systems work. I've spent my career building infrastructure, redundancies, fail-safes, audit trails. And the one thing I've learned is that the loudest alarm is never the most effective one. The most effective one is the one that's already been recording. I didn't have access to the footage, but I knew it existed. I knew it was sitting on a server somewhere intact. And I knew that whoever controlled Grandma's estate, her executor, her lawyer, would eventually need to access it. The screenshot proved motive. The cameras would prove the crime. All I had to do was show up to the will reading and let the system I built do what systems do, tell the truth without raising its voice. So I stopped defending myself out loud. I stopped getting quiet out of helplessness and started getting quiet on purpose. When Robert called to check in, I kept it short. When Sandra sent a text asking if I'd found anything of Mom's that belongs to the family, I replied with one word, no. When Veronica posted a photo of Grandma's living room with the caption, "Cleaning out Grandma's place, so many memories," I didn't comment. I didn't react. It didn't give them a single thing to use against me. Let them talk. Let them scheme. Let them build their careful little story. Because somewhere in the cloud, another story was already written. In timestamps and pixels and the steady green blink of a camera that never stopped watching. Gerald Aldridge called on a Monday. Polite, measured, the kind of voice that charges $400 an hour and earns every cent. The will reading was scheduled for the following Thursday, 10:00 in the morning at his office in downtown Hartford. He asked if I'd be attending. I said yes. Then I asked if there was anything I should prepare. He paused, the kind of pause that holds something back, and said, "Just bring yourself, Ms. Sheridan." That same evening, Veronica texted me. "No greeting, no small talk. FYI, the reading is Thursday. You probably shouldn't come. It'll be awkward for you." I read the text twice, deleted nothing, saved the screenshot. Then I replied, "I'll be there." She didn't respond. Over the next 3 days, the family moved like they were rehearsing for a performance. Sandra called Aunt Margaret to ask what she was wearing. Not out of kindness, but to assess whether Margaret would be a problem. Robert emailed the lawyer's office twice asking for a rough outline of the distribution. Veronica posted a story of herself at a nail salon with the caption, "Self-care before a hard week." And I went to work. I configured a load balancer for a client in Stamford. I debugged a storage migration. I ate lunch at my desk and drove home at 6:15 and folded laundry while the news played on mute. Normal things. Small things. The kind of things you do when you know something is coming, but you can't stop it. So you just make sure the rest of your life is still standing when it hits. Thursday morning, I put on a gray blazer, a white blouse, and a pair of flats I bought for my college graduation 9 years ago. I didn't wear jewelry. I didn't need to. Wednesday night, the night before the reading, I drove to Grandma's house one more time. I didn't plan to. I was on my way home from the grocery store and the turn came up and my hands just moved the wheel. The house was dark. The porch light was off. Nobody had replaced the bulb since the funeral. I let myself in with my key. The same key Sandra had tried to take back twice. The kitchen smelled like dust and lemon cleaner. The recliner was empty. The Afghan was folded on the couch, which meant someone had moved it. I walked through the rooms slowly, touching nothing, remembering everything. The counter where she'd kneaded dough, the window where she watched cardinals, the hook by the door where she hung her apron, the one with the faded sunflowers she refused to replace because it still works fine. I stopped in the living room doorway. The camera was still mounted in the corner above the bookshelf, angled toward the kitchen and the front hall. The little green light blinked, steady, patient, still recording, still uploading to a cloud account I couldn't access, on a server I couldn't touch. Holding footage I couldn't see. I stared at that light for a long time. It stared back. "What did you see?" I whispered to the empty room. The light blinked. I locked the door behind me, drove home, and slept for 4 hours. In the morning, I put on the blazer, brushed my hair, and drove to Hartford. I didn't know what the will said. I didn't know what the cameras had captured. I didn't know that in 90 minutes, every lie my family had told would be played back to them in high definition. All I knew was that Grandma had said, "I see more than they think," and Dorothy Vance never bluffed. Gerald Aldridge's office was on the 4th floor of a brick building on Asylum Street, 3 blocks from the Capitol. Polished wood, leather chairs, a conference table that seated 12. It smelled like old paper and new coffee. I arrived at 9:48. Aunt Margaret was already there, sitting near the window in her turquoise glasses, hands folded in her lap. She gave me a small nod. No words, Robert and Sandra came next. Robert wore a navy suit that pulled at the buttons. Sandra wore black. Still in funeral mode, still performing. She carried a leather folder as if she planned to take notes. Veronica arrived last, 5 minutes late, in heels and a cream blazer, phone already in hand. She scanned the room like she was checking a seating chart. 2 of Grandma's cousins, Harold and June, sat near the door. They were in their 70s, quiet, they're out of obligation. A legal assistant sat in the corner with a laptop. Aldridge stood at the head of the table, silver hair, wire-rimmed glasses, a pen in his breast pocket. He greeted each of us by name and waited for Veronica to sit down before opening the file. The room was tight, not physically. The table was large enough, but the air felt compressed, like everyone was breathing shallowly and pretending not to. Robert kept adjusting his cuffs. Sandra's eyes swept the table, cataloging who was where. Veronica leaned back in her chair with her arms crossed, already bored. I sat at the far end next to Margaret. My hands were flat on the table, my blazer was buttoned, I had nothing in front of me. No folder, no phone, no expectations. Veronica glanced at me once and whispered something to Sandra. Sandra didn't look my way, but the corner of her mouth twitched. "Bold of her to show up," Veronica murmured. I heard it. I let it pass. Aldridge opened by reading the preamble. Standard language. I, Dorothy Ann Vance, being of sound mind and body. The kind of words that make death feel administrative. He read slowly, clearly, with the practiced neutrality of a man who had done this hundreds of times. The first bequests were small. Grandma's antique clock, the one with the ship's wheel face, went to Cousin Harold. A set of first edition Agatha Christie novels went to June. A donation of $5,000 to the Hadley Community Library, where Grandma had volunteered every Tuesday for 11 years. Margaret received Grandma's writing desk, a walnut piece from the 1940s that had belonged to their mother. Margaret pressed her glasses up her nose and whispered, "Thank you, Dot." The room relaxed. These were the safe items, the decorative ones, the ones nobody was going to fight over. Robert shifted in his seat. Sandra uncapped a pen. Veronica uncrossed her arms and leaned forward slightly, the first sign of real interest. They were waiting for the main event, the house, the savings account, the investment portfolio, the estate. I watched them watch Aldridge, and I recognized the look on their faces. It wasn't grief. It wasn't respect. It was anticipation. The same look you see at an auction before the bidding starts. Robert had already done the math. I could see it in the way his jaw worked, silently adding up the house's market value, the savings, the liquid assets. Sandra had her pen ready as if the will was a contract she intended to negotiate. And Veronica was already composing the Instagram post in her head. I could see her choosing the filter. Aldridge turned to the next page. He paused. The pause was longer than it needed to be. Nobody noticed but me. Before Aldridge could continue, Veronica spoke. She didn't raise her hand. She didn't wait for a break. She just cut in as if the will reading were a meeting she was running. "Before we go further," she said, her voice polished and steady, "I think we need to address something." She turned in her chair to face the table. "Several pieces of Grandma's jewelry have gone missing over the past year. A bracelet, earrings, Grandpa's wedding ring, and most recently the pearl necklace." She paused for effect. She'd rehearsed this. "We all know who had the most access to Grandma's house, who had a key, who was there every week, sometimes multiple times a week, unsupervised." She didn't say my name. Not yet. Sandra picked up the thread. "We've been discussing this privately," she said, opening her leather folder. "And we feel it's important to put it on record before any distributions are made." She pulled out a typed list, dates, items, estimated values, a document. She'd brought a document. Robert cleared his throat. "Nobody is making accusations," he said, making an accusation. But Cora was the only one with consistent physical access, and the timeline matches. Then he looked at me. They all looked at me. Harold and June shifted uncomfortably. The legal assistant stopped typing. Margaret's hand found mine under the table, and I sat there at the end of a conference table being convicted of a crime I didn't commit by the people who actually committed it. Right here. Every head in that room turned to me. And I want you to remember one thing before I tell you what happened next. I still had no idea the cameras had caught anything. So if you're rooting for me, hit that subscribe button now, because the next 90 seconds are why I'm telling this story at all. Veronica stood up. She actually stood as if this were a courtroom and she was delivering a closing argument. "Let's be honest," she said. "We all know what happened. Cora had keys. Cora was there alone. Cora was the one handling Grandma's things." She swept her hand around the table, gathering the room. "Does anyone here disagree?" Nobody spoke. Robert shook his head slowly, reinforcing the silence. Sandra pressed her lips together in a thin line of practiced sympathy. Harold looked at the table. June looked at the window. Even Margaret, my one ally, flinched. "So before we talk about who gets what," Veronica continued, her voice rising just enough to fill the room, "I think it needs to be said." She looked directly at me. "She doesn't deserve a penny." The words landed like a slap against tile, clean, sharp, final. The room didn't gasp. It agreed. Robert nodded. Sandra folded her hands. Harold avoided my eyes. June studied her fingernails, and I did nothing. I didn't stand. I didn't argue. I didn't pull out the screenshot Margaret had given me and slam it on the table. I just sat there with my hands flat on the wood and my jaw locked, and my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my teeth. I thought about defending myself. I wrote the opening sentence in my head. I have never taken a single thing from that house. But the words wouldn't come. Because the truth is, when every person in a room has already decided you're guilty, speaking Anla makes you look more desperate. So I stayed quiet, the way I'd been quiet my whole life, the way Grandma had been quiet in the months before she died. And I would learn in about 4 minutes that Grandma's quiet had teeth. The silence after Veronica's words was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. Nobody corrected her. Nobody said, "Wait, let's hear Cora's side." Nobody so much as shifted in my direction with a look that said, "This isn't right." I was alone in a room full of relatives, and every single one of them had chosen a side. Mine wasn't it. I thought about the pearls. I thought about the cedar box empty on the dresser. I thought about every Sunday I'd driven through, whether that would have kept a sane person home, every bill I'd quietly paid when Grandma's fixed income ran short, every night I'd slept on her couch when the home health aide canceled and someone needed to be there at 3:00 in the morning to check her oxygen levels. None of it mattered, not to them. I pushed my chair back. I was going to leave. My keys were in my coat pocket. My car was in the garage on the second level. I could be home in 45 minutes and spend the rest of my life pretending this family didn't exist. Margaret's hand tightened on mine, just once, just enough. I stayed. And as I sat back down, 2 things echoed in my head. She doesn't deserve a penny. Veronica's voice, still hanging in the air like smoke, and underneath it, quieter, older, stubborn as oak. I see more than they think. Grandma's voice from a Sunday that felt like 100 years ago. The green light blinks. The soup gets cold. The truth sits on a server in Virginia, patient as stone. I didn't know any of that yet. All I knew was that I was still sitting in that chair, and that felt like enough. Gerald Aldridge let the silence hold for exactly 4 seconds. I counted. Then he removed his glasses, cleaned them with a cloth from his pocket, and placed them back on his nose with the calm of a man who has watched families unravel over money more times than he can count. "Before anyone leaves," he said, "I'd like to note that Mrs. Vance anticipated this moment." The room shifted. Robert uncrossed his arms. Sandra's pen stopped moving. Veronica, still standing, looked at the lawyer like he'd just spoken a language she didn't recognize. "What do you mean, anticipated?" Robert asked. Aldridge reached into a manila envelope beside his file. It was sealed, the kind-off seal you don't break casually, with red wax and an embossed stamp from his firm. "Your mother came to see me 4 months before her passing," he said. "She was very specific about how this meeting should proceed." He broke the seal. Inside was a single typed letter, a USB drive, and a pawn shop receipt. Aldridge set each item on the table, one at a time, like a man laying out evidence, which, as it turned out, was exactly what he was doing. "Mrs. Vance left an addendum to her will," he said. "Along with supporting materials she asked me to present in full to everyone in this room." He looked up. His eyes moved from Robert to Sandra to Veronica, then to me, and then, "This is the part I'll remember for the rest of my life." Gerald Aldridge smiled. Not a smirk, not satisfaction, a smile of someone fulfilling a promise to a woman he respected, a woman who had sat in his office, frail and sharp-eyed, and told him exactly what she wanted to happen in this room on this day. "Shall we continue?" he said. Aldridge unfolded the letter and read the first line aloud. "To my family gathered here, I hope you're comfortable because what follows may change the way you see each other." Robert leaned forward. Sandra gripped her pen. Veronica sat down slowly as if the air had been pressed out of her legs. Aldridge continued. "For the past 8 months, items have been disappearing from my home. Jewelry, cash, keepsakes your father left me. I noticed. I said nothing because I wanted to be sure. He turned the page. When Cora installed the cameras in my home last year, she did it to keep me safe. She set up the cloud account under my name and removed her own access because that's the kind of person she is. She respects boundaries even when no one else does. Sandra's face went white. Robert's jaw tightened. Veronica's eyes darted to the USB drive on the table. I taught myself how to log in. Cora had shown me how months earlier when she was explaining how the backup worked. She was patient. She drew diagrams. She didn't know I'd actually use it. Aldridge paused and looked up. The room was airless. I reviewed the footage, all of it. I figured out how to download the clips I needed. It took me 3 evenings and a lot of squinting, and I saved them to a USB drive Gerald gave me. And I know exactly who has been taking from me. He set the letter down and picked up the USB drive. Then he said the words that split Thurum in 2. Actually, she left everything to the one who helped her catch the thief in this family. Veronica let out a short, sharp laugh. "What thief?" she said, but her voice had changed. The polish was gone. The rehearsal was gone. What was left was a 31-year-old woman who had just realized that the dead don't always stay silent. Aldridge plugged the USB drive into his laptop and turned the screen to face the table. The legal assistant dimmed the overhead lights without being asked, as if this had been arranged. The first clip was dated August 14th. The living room camera. Nighttime. The timestamp read 11:47. The front door opened. Robert walked in. He was wearing a jacket and sneakers, moving quickly, not turning on the lights. He went straight to the bedroom. The camera caught him through the doorway, pulling open the top drawer of Grandma's dresser, removing a small velvet pouch, the garnet earrings, and tucking it into his jacket pocket. He was in and out in under 3 minutes. The second clip was dated September 22nd. Same camera. Daytime this time. Grandma was asleep in her recliner. The Afghan was over her legs. Veronica walked in through the front door carrying a grocery bag she never unpacked. She went to the bedroom. The camera caught her opening the cedar box on the dresser. She lifted out the pearl necklace. She held it up for a moment. 2 seconds, maybe 3. Then dropped it into her purse and zipped it shut. She walked back through the living room without looking at Grandma. She left the grocery bag on the kitchen counter. It was still there when Cora came the next Sunday. The third clip was dated October 9th. Sandra standing at the front door glancing left and right before waving Robert inside. The room went silent, not the kind of silence that comes from shock, the kind that comes from recognition. The slow, irreversible understanding that you are watching something you cannot unsee, cannot deny, and cannot undo. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Harold closed his eyes. June covered her mouth. Margaret squeezed my hand so hard the bones shifted. Veronica broke first. "That's fake," she said. Her voice was too high, too fast. "Someone edited that. That's not real." She turned to Robert. "Tell them it's not real." Robert didn't answer. His face had gone gray, the color of wet newspaper, and his hands were flat on the table, pressing down like the surface might give way. Sandra started talking, not to any own specific, just into the room, a stream of words aimed at no one. "This is out of context. We were checking on her. Robert had every right to be there. She's his mother." Aldridge let them talk. He didn't interrupt. He didn't argue. He just sat at the head of the table with his hands folded, the way a man sits when he knows the evidence has already spoken. "Those cameras were illegal," Veronica tried. You can't just film people without consent." "Ms. Vance," Aldridge said quietly, "this is a homeowner's security system installed in her own residence on her own property recording persons who entered voluntarily. There is no consent requirement under Connecticut law for video surveillance in a private home. Your grandmother was well aware of this." Veronica's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Sandra pushed back from the table. "I want a lawyer. You're welcome to retain one," Aldridge replied. Then he turned to me, "And here's what I didn't do. I didn't stand up. I didn't point. I didn't say I told you so. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice." I sat at the end of that table in my gray blazer and my graduation flats. and I looked at the family that had called me a thief, and I said nothing, because the truth had already spoken, and the truth didn't need my help. Aldridge picked up the letter again. To Cora, he read, "You never asked me for anything. Not the house, not the jewelry, not even a thank you. You came because you wanted to come. You stayed because that's who you are. You set up those cameras to watch over me. You didn't know I'd end up watching them, too." He paused. The room was so quiet I could hear the HVAC system cycling through the vent above the window. I don't blame Robert. I don't blame Sandra or Veronica. Blame doesn't fix what's broken. But I won't pretend I didn't see what I saw, and I won't let you take the fall for what they did. He set the letter down and placed the pawn shop receipt next to it. "This receipt," he said, "was found in Mr. Vance's vehicle during a search conducted by a private investigator retained by Mrs. Vance prior to her death. It documents the sale of a pearl necklace described as he read from the receipt. Freshwater pearl strand, gold clasp. Estimated value $12,400. The receipt is in Mr. Robert Vance's name, dated October 30th. Robert closed his eyes. Sandra put her face in her hands. Veronica stared at the receipt like it might disappear if she looked hard enough. Aldridge read the last line of Dorothy's letter. "I left it to the one who came when no one was watching." He folded the letter, placed it in the envelope, and looked at me. "Mrs. Vance's amended will, executed with 2 witnesses and notarized on November 2nd, designates Miss Cora Sheridan as the sole beneficiary of the residuary estate, including the property at 412 Maple Lane, all financial accounts and all personal effects. The pearl necklace isto be recovered and returned to Miss Sheridan." The room cracked open. Robert stood, knocking his chair back. "This is insane. I'll contest this. She was sick. She wasn't in her right mind." Aldridge didn't flinch. "Mrs. Vance underwent a cognitive evaluation 3 days before executing the amendment. The results are attached. She scored in the 97th percentile for her age group." Sandra was crying, not the way people cry when they're sorry, the way they cry when they've been caught and the Kriengis the only tool left. "She was our mother," Sandra managed. "We took care of her, too." "The footage suggests otherwise," Aldridge said. That was all. Veronica grabbed her purse and headed for the door. She stopped with her hand on the knob and turned back to me. Her eyes were wet, but the look behind them wasn't grief. It was fury. The specific fury of someone who has been outplayed by a woman they underestimated. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. I stood. I picked up the cedar box. Aldridge had brought it from the house as part of the estate materials. I held it in both hands and I said one thing: "You can keep the story you told. I'll keep the truth she left." Then I sat back down, placed the cedar box on the table in front of me, and waited for the rest of the paperwork. Nobody else spoke. Margaret was crying. Harold cleared his throat and looked at the ceiling. June dabbed her eyes with a tissue. The legal assistant typed something into the laptop, and Gerald Aldridge, who had kept a dead woman's promise down to the last comma, turned to the next page. The aftermath was legal and measurable. Aldridge outlined the restitution terms Dorothy had specified in the addendum. Robert was presented with a choice. Sign a restitution agreement to repay the appraised value of all items taken, totaling just over $41,000, including the pond pearls, the garnet earrings, Grandpa's wedding band, the bracelet, and the cufflinks, or the estate would file a civil recovery claim. He signed. 90 days to pay in full. The private investigator's report, the footage, and the pawn receipt were all on file if he didn't. I chose not to pursue criminal charges, not because they didn't deserve it, but because Grandma didn't ask me to. Her letter said, "I don't blame Robert," and I trusted her judgment more than my anger. Robert sold his boat within 2 weeks. Sandra stopped posting on the church Facebook page. Veronica deactivated her Instagram the day after the reading and hasn't reactivated it since. The pearls were recovered from the pawn shop. Aldridge's investigator had already arranged it and returned to the estate. The cedar box wasn't empty anymore. Aunt Margaret walked me to my car after the reading. She didn't say much. She put her hand on my shoulder, the way Grandma used to, and said, "She always knew, sweetheart. She always knew." I drove home with the cedar box on the passenger seat and the windows down even though it was December because I needed cold air to remind me that I was real and this had actually happened. I kept the house. I moved in 3 weeks after the reading into the bedroom I'd slept in as a teenager with the same quilt and the same view of the maple tree in the backyard. I kept the recliner. I kept the Afghan. I kept the filing cabinet with the insurance folder and the address book and the recipe for chicken soup written on a yellow index card in Grandma's handwriting. Carrots, celery, 1 bay leaf from the jar, low heat, don't rush it. Sundays are still Sundays. Margaret comes now. She drives over from Glastonbury and we sit at the kitchen table, and I serve the soup in the blue Tupperware because it doesn't taste right in anything else. Harold and June come once a month. A couple of the younger cousins, the ones who hadn't been pulled into the current, started calling again. I didn't make them apologize. I just opened the door. Robert hasn't called. Sandra sent a card at Christmas. No return address, no apology, just a generic peace and blessings message printed inside. I recycled it. Veronica I haven't seen at all. The door is closed. Not locked, just closed. Last week I took the pearl necklace out of the safe deposit box I'd moved it to and placed it back in the cedar box on the dresser where it belongs. I held it for a moment, felt the weight of it, the cool smoothness of each bead. The tiny gold clasp shaped like a seashell that my grandfather saved 11 months of skipped lunches to buy. Then I looked up at the corner of the living room. The camera was still there. The little green light was still blinking. I reached up and turned it off. The light went dark for the first time in 14 months. I didn't need it anymore. Grandma didn't need it anymore. The truth had done its work, and some lights are only meant to stay on until the right person finally sees them. Grandma never raised her voice once in 81 years. She just made sure that in the end the truth got the last word. That's my story. A quiet woman, a blinking green light, and a grandmother who saw everything. If someone in your life shows up when no one's watching, tell them today. Don't wait for a will to say it for you. And if this story reminded you of someone, share it with them. Thank you for being here. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.